Okay, it is now 1 o'clock. Let's put some of this stuff in mute and let's get started. Okay, let's begin with Module 2. Module 2 covers 3 more chapters. It also has a Module 2 lecture review, just like last week, where you'll have about 3 questions or 4 questions per chapter, and another net lab assignment where you'll do a couple more labs and a quiz at the end of the module. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat, either on Discord or Zoom. Uh, it is easier. I would suggest doing the chat on Discord, only because that's where it can stay saved and anyone can see what happened. But let's begin with Chapter 4, Managing Disks and File Systems. So Windows can handle various types of disks. The 2 main ways that Windows handles it is, are they connected to me physically or are they presented to me? And that can be either an external or internal disk or a virtual disk or multiple disks connected as one. The internal disk is the most conventional, traditional, the one that's physically connected to the system via cable. So like a solid state drive or like a spinning disk, or even a disk that's connected through the PCI. Your externals are your typical things like USB or eSATA, wireless, Thunderbolt. They're still a part of the system, but they are easily removable. Ideally, you don't want operating systems running off of an external drive just because it'll be slower to connect. And the last thing you really want is a drive that you're running the operating system on to be accidentally disconnected and corrupt a whole lot of stuff. A virtual disk is really, so you can think of a virtual disk like a zip file. It's just a file that is pretending to be a hard drive. Windows natively supports Microsoft's own standard of VHD. The other big standard that's around is VMware's. And Microsoft can't, or Windows doesn't necessarily handle VMware's disk natively, but it will VHD. A logical disk can be combined with multiple to make one large disk, kind of like a RAID array. I always have some problems with a software RAID, because if the operating system ever does get corrupted, then the software RAID is lost, versus if it's a hardware RAID and something happens to the operating system, it doesn't affect the array. So my 2 cents are, though it is possible to create arrays through the software, I think it's safer to do it via hardware. There are 2 main partition styles that exist. It's either the master boot record, which is the old, and the GPT, which is the new. MBR has been around for quite some time. It is the older of the 2. It is where the operating system normally resides. It can handle disks up to 2 terabytes in size, whereas GPT can handle disks larger than 2 terabytes and is bootable as long as the BIOS is an updated UEFI. So if you have a drive that is GPT partitioned but is connected to a old BIOS system, it may not boot. The 2 have to match with each other in order to boot. So disks can be arranged as either a basic disk, a dynamic disk, or storage spaces. And we'll cover what these three mean in just a bit. So our basic disk, it is MBR style. All its space can be organized into one or more partitions. And those are stored in basically what's considered as the table of contents. A dynamic disk can be either a master boot record or GPT. They can handle more. They can handle more partitions than MBR. MBR has a limit of 4, whereas GPT does not have that limit. Instead of being called partitions, they're more or less called volumes. It is possible to boot off of a dynamic disk. At the time of this writing, for the textbook, it was not possible to really boot from it, but now it is possible as long as the operating system is 64-bit and the BIOS is UEFI. It is completely possible to boot from a dynamic disk. So don't let this slide mislead you. Storage spaces is actually a bit of a problem. In the last update to Windows 10, and I'll put this link in the links reference for you there, and here I'll show you to you here. This was August 3rd of this year, so this is not old at all. There was a bug that corrupted storage spaces. Like I was saying about software versus hardware, this is a software solution. And because it's software, it will have its problems, and it is possible to break it because it's running from the operating system. Now, that is not to say hardware doesn't have the same problem either. It's just not as easy to break a hardware RAID versus a software RAID. But anywho, storage spaces is an inexpensive way to combine multiple disks together using the operating system. It came about in 2012. Yes, it is less expensive because you're using software to do the RAID function versus buying a RAID controller. But like this article that I found from the 3rd of August, you pay for it one way or another. So it combines disks to put them into a storage pool, and that storage pool is a representation of all the disks together. Once the disks are assigned to the pool, then storage spaces in general can access it. It can work with a variety of disks because it is software-based. So in hardware-based RAID, the disks need to be the same size, or the RAID will be created to whatever the smallest disk is. It has that limitation, and you don't necessarily have that limitation with software. But you might run into the problems like the one I just showed you. Pros and cons to everything. You can hot swap disks as needed because it's all software based. You can over provision or over allocate space. So if you have, you could create a pool of 900 gigabytes, but really only have 500 gigabytes of physical disks. So you have 400 gigs that will either get that Windows has to figure out. Okay, either we're going to get rid of some data or we're going to save less into the pool. We have to figure something out. So you can fiddle around with the numbers because again, it's all software based. It's not hardware based. If you don't have a way to do backups, if you don't have a failover, just like in hardware, things can get corrupted. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in either the Discord or Zoom. This moves on from storage spaces into the disk management tools, and these are the native tools that you have in Windows. So the two big ones are disk management and disk part, one being GUI-based, one being text-based. The disk management console, you will see if you run computer management, or you could call it by itself. It is your graphical user interface. It is like Gparted for Linux, where you can take effects on drives automatically. This is what it looks like. It's pretty much looked the same ever since it came about forever and a day ago, where you can see the drives that are connected to it, and you see the partitions that exist and what kind of a disk is it. Is it a basic disk, a dynamic? Is it a optical drive? This part is its partner, who is command line based. So great for things like scheduling tasks or having an action done without a GUI. This is what it looks like when you run this part. The menu will change for a little bit, and you can run certain commands within this part. Kind of like if you're running Metasploitable or Metasploit, you'll see that. Or if you're running a Python-based program, the command line changes. Your physical disks, the two big things that you'll need to do is installing and replacing them. When you add a new disk to any operating system, whether Windows or not, they all need to be prepared because they come in blank. A basic disk in Windows can be moved from one computer to another and will stay a basic disk, whereas a dynamic disk has to be changed. Because the whole dynamic situation works within that operating system. So when you move it from one computer to another, it has to basically be updated and changed. Whereas basic applies to any, because basic was the first type of drive that was built into Windows. So it is very much backwards compatible. Any disk that it does not recognize will show up as foreign. So if you connect a drive that was formatted to Mac OS, it's going to look like a foreign disk. Or formatted to NTFS3 for Linux, it'll show up as foreign, so you'll need to import it and or reformat in order for Windows to be able to read and write to it. When we're talking about storage spaces, if you're moving entire set over, then the whole pool should be moved. It shouldn't just be one disk. The whole set should be moved over. Like I said, when you're getting a new disk in, but now this stuff happens automatically. As soon as you connect something, it starts looking for the hardware change. It'll scan the disk and it'll tell you, hey, we need to initialize a said disk. The device manager is normally the one who handles this kind of stuff, but you can also do it through the computer management. Any new disks are not seen immediately by Windows, so you have to force the manual recheck and go through that process. Once they're initialized, now they can be used. Otherwise, Windows can't touch them and do anything with them. Again, if you're in disk management, you will get a little pop-up that'll tell you this disk needs to get initialized. Let's begin. When it comes to virtual disks, it can pretty much do the same thing of creating the disk, attaching and detaching while the system is running, especially because it's software-based. A VHD can exist as a single file, which generally is, easiest to have as a single file. You do have to specify where it is, its size, its format, and its type when you create it. Once it's attached, it will look and act just like a physical disk. And just because you create a virtual disk of 500 gigabytes, but your physical disk really only has 100, it doesn't mean you can store 500 gigabytes. It's going to crash because the virtual is just a number. You know, the physical actually matters. It is easy to dismount a virtual disk because, again, it's basically a zip file. Most easily like a right-click method, really, to detach a VHD. And then you can move that file around as needed, reattaching to another machine and accessing it like a USB drive and moving on. The storage spaces view can help you administer and control your storage spaces. That is where you need to go to initialize storage spaces if you are to use it. This is what it looks like. It's in the control panel under System and Security. Once a pool is created, like this pool, this example pool, you see it's 10 gigabytes and it's using 768 megabytes to start, or it's a 4.25 capacity using one gig. I was reading the thing about under it. Once it's all done and working, then you can either rename it, you can add this to it, you can optimize, so on and so forth. It does handle some fault tolerance, which is good. But again, if there is a problem within the OS, that may mess with the entire fault tolerance. Here are some of the resiliencies that exist within storage spaces, which is great. You have a two-way mirror, a three-way mirror, or even a parity. But if there's a bug like there was in August that corrupts the whole thing, then yikes. These are the file systems that Windows recognizes. FAT, which is the oldest, NTFS, the second oldest, ReFS, the new one, and UDF, which is used for optical disks. Like I said, FAT has been around since MS-DOS in the 80s and is still used today. The three that exist are FAT, FAT32, and exFAT, with exFAT being the one that can handle larger files. If you're ever copying data into a USB stick and let's say the file that you're copying over is more than 4 gigabytes big, and when it reaches about that point, it stops and it tells you that there's a problem and you're like, what is happening? It's because it was formatted in FAT. Because FAT cannot allocate more than 4 gigabytes for a single file. Nowadays, you should not be using FAT as the file system for your operating system, namely because of its file size limitations, because how old it is, and it provides no file system security whatsoever. Ideally, you should only use FAT in a USB drive or something small like that, or like an SD card on your phone, but it should not be your main file system. NTFS came about in the early 2000s when NT came. It has not changed much in the 20 years since it's been around. which is a problem. Uh, Windows pretty much solely runs on NTFS, and with not much changes in the 20 years since its existence, it means that the all the security checks that have been put in place have been breached, have been figured out, have been cracked. So looking at NTFS itself, it does things like log file and checkpoint. It does alternate data streams. It does encrypting file system, and that came about when like XP came to existence. And it does do file and folder permissions, whereas FAT didn't do any of that. It does do compression. You can also do things like disk quotas and symbolic links, all stuff that you can already do in the Linux OS. You can do within NTFS. Disk quotas can be useful if we're dealing with a server and many users. You can limit how much they can save, and the OS can automatically issue warnings to the whatever user is eating up a lot of space. Here is a picture of the quota entries. You can mount empty folders in an NTFS partition system. And you would do that through the disk management console, kind of like mounting a VHD file, but instead of a VHD file, it's a folder. And you can point to a file or folder located somewhere else. Now I see a question of what are the different types layouts of layouts? Oh, what are the different types of file systems? I mean, there's a lot of different types of file systems, but the four that Windows sees are FAT, NTFS, REFS, and UDF. Anything else, you have to install a program in order to read. Like if you want to read a APFS Apple file system, you have to install a program. Or if you want to read Linux file systems, you have to install a program into Windows in order for it to read. And sometimes it can just read and not be able to write. Symbolic links are great because you may not have to show the exact location of where something is stored. This is good when we need to share information, and it may, if we have any fear that it might fall in the wrong hands, they won't be able to access where the actual data is. We can cut off their access without affecting the actual data itself. REFS, if you've never heard of REFS, I'll put a link in our links reference overview. It is newer than NTFS. And from reading the overview, reading some documentation, it looks like they're looking to eventually replace NTFS with REFS. It's not quite there yet, though. So, for example, things like file and folder compression, disk quotas, and EFS don't exist in REFS. You also can't boot to an REFS system. You can mount it, but you can't boot from it. And like I said, UDF is what you typically see in an optical disc, and it can read and write as long as the DVD or the optical drive can write to a disk. Some of the common file system changes that you would do on a system are like changing the assigned drive letter or converting the installed file system that exists. The drive letters are assigned alphabetically. By tradition, A and B are given over to a floppy, and that's why they're not automatically assigned. C, D, and E tend to be, or C tends to be the one for the internal drive, and then D forward for opticals and anything else that follows. You can always change those letters. They are not at all permanent to a system. Like I said, you can convert between these, the main three that Windows uses. Just remember that if you go from FAT to NTFS or to ReFS, you're going to gain and lose some stuff. And in the conversion, you ideally don't want to keep any data there. You want a clean slate. Partitions can be cut. So there's a question in the chat. Why does a partition of a drive become unhealthy? Yeah, that could be either the hardware itself is dying. It could be that there is a lot of corruption within the disk. All the Windows file systems get fragmented, where data from one file is stored in one place and saved in another. So when a file is read, all those pieces have to be brought back together in order to be read, which is why you have to defragment. It's not so much a problem with like an SSD because it reads and writes quickly. But that does end up leading to file corruption later and causing the disk itself to become unhealthy. But normally corruption is the number one reason why it's showing up as unhealthy. You can also convert disks through the command line that has been around, as long as you have full admin access. All the major file systems that Windows uses has attributes, and you can see these attributes in the File Explorer when you hit the properties. Those attributes are down at the bottom. In this picture, this file has attributes of either read-only or hidden, and then there's an advanced button that can see a little more. Which are these? You can archive. This file can be indexed. We can compress or encrypt it. If you choose to encrypt a folder, then does this apply to just the folder or the folder and the contents within it? Those are two different things. So the flags, which are the items you just saw earlier, they control what can the operating system do with this data. So if the read-only is turned on, then we can't make any changes. If the archive bit is set, then whenever we do backups, it can get backed up or indicate, hey, this file needs to get backed up. If it's hidden, then it won't be seen by users, and you'll have to unhide it in order to see it, or use like the folder option to show hidden files. If you set it to system, then it's only viewed by the operating system and not by users in groups. There is an option in the folder settings to view system files, and you'll see like files even in your main drive that you didn't know existed, but were there, that are only accessible to the system itself. Compression is just like anything else. NTFS has its own built-in compression system. When you copy a compressed file, it will grow back up to its normal size, because the drive you're copying to may not have the same compression setting as the one where it came from. Encryption, again, supported by NTFS only at this time. It is normally set by the security key of the user. This is why it's important in a business environment, if you're using encryption, that you do not delete the user from your Active Directory. If you have enabled encryption at your organization and a user encrypts their data on Windows and they quit or they leave or they move on, you should disable the account so they can't log in again to make any changes. But once they're gone, you can reset that password to something you know as the admin, log in as that user, and be able to access the files. The last thing you want to do is when a employee leaves, that you delete that account, and now they encrypted this data, and now you have to spend more time trying to break it than just being able to get in, access the data, and move on. You want to save yourself that pain. So whenever you're dealing with users and someone is leaving, make sure that you disable, not delete the account. At least delete it once you have everything out and you've done anything compliant related and it's okay to do so. Otherwise, just disable the account so nobody can use it. You can use access control lists to really use a fine-grained approach as to who can access what data and how. These are great as we deal with sensitive information. The default permissions you can see are on the root folder or the C drive in Windows. And then those apply out to the rest of the hard drive. Anybody who's an administrator has full control. The operating system has full control as well. Users can read and execute programs, and then authenticated users, which is different from just any other user, can create folders in the C drive and create files and write them in subfolders, not in the main folder. That's your default permissions. That doesn't mean keep them, but you know where you start from. So if you're trying to meet compliance, you know that this needs to change. Or if you're trying to harden your system, you know that this needs to change as well. So here is the look at the security for the C drive. On a typical system, again, you should not keep the default settings. You should adjust as needed. Like I said, the default permissions, admins can do anything and everything. Felt like I went backwards, but no, that is the default. These are the default settings, and they probably shouldn't stay. These additional folders that are created will inherit the permissions from the parent. And if you feel, or to meet compliance, you see that these are inadequate, then those should be changed. When you assign permissions, they can be set in either the NTFS standard or individual, but inheritance does happen. Here are the predetermined list of NTFS permissions that you can read about, from write, read, list the contents, read and execute, modify, full control, and special. Individually, you can say this specific user can do these things. And here's a list of all the advanced permissions that you see in an NTFS partition drive. So you have a couple of options when we talk about permission scope. is it limited to just the one file we're talking about? Or does it include the folder that we're talking about and not the files within it? And you have all these options on how does the permissions that we're creating, how does it affect the data that we're working with? Again, the permissions apply to the first folder and where they're used, and then it propagates out. You can block inheritance so that it just applies to the folder, but not the files. This can get muddy, especially if you make any mistake and you lose access to the file. You might spend some time reorganizing the permissions afterwards. Some ways that you can see what the permissions will do is through effective permissions to see the results before you actually apply them. So if you're thinking of, let me change these settings, what is it going to look like for the guest? And then Windows will tell you, well, this is what it will look like for them. In this case, they won't have full control. They won't be able to change permission or take ownership, but they'll be able to do everything else. So you can see it before it takes effect. Every file and folder has an owner. That is the user who can assign permissions. Be careful when changing the owner, because it may prevent you from making changes later on. Depending on the target location where you're copying, some of these permissions will stay or some of them will go away. For example, if you're moving from from NTFS to FAT, all the permissions go away. If you're copying from one NTFS system to another NTFS system, some of them may stay, some of them may no longer work because the user doesn't exist in the target system. This can get tricky. But again, when you need to manage file system permission, remember that admins have full control. Users have control to their own profiles, and users should not be able to edit other users. Any questions? Cool. So I will stop this recording and create the video and upload it. Take a little break. Drink a little water while we wait for it to process. Right. So if your fan speeds and clock speeds say they're blocked by admin, then it's probably blocked by a admin user, not necessarily you as the admin. Yeah, 60%. Yeah, that's Windows for you. Don't really know when permissions get changed. There's no real alert of permission changes, but it happens and you have to deal with it. Cool, looks like the file is done. So I'll upload that. And say week 2, chapter 4. Add it to our playlist. Not made for kids. Next, next, public. Excellent. Okay. So now let's move on. Okay. So let's move on into chapter 5, user management. User accounts are required in order for a user to interact. This can be not only a person, but can be a program. The local user account exists only there and nowhere else. A Microsoft account is stored in the cloud. A user account is, again, what we use to log into Windows. They can integrate with other accounts or other systems as needed. The passwords are stored in this really archaic system called the SAM database, or the Security Accounts Manager database. There is a well-documented tool called Mimikatz who can extract the hashes of the passwords and break them for you. Well, it can extract them, and you can use things like rainbow tables and or password cracking tools like Hashcat to break them. But it is well documented on how to get that information out. Your sign-in methods into a system can be either the Windows screen, it could be remote like RDP, it could be command line as well. The Windows sign-in screen is what you see when a system is joined to the domain. Or sorry, when it's not joined into the domain, you see that sign-in screen. Your secure sign-in is the one that has Control-Alt-Delete. There are programs now who can do that command. It used to be for the longest that no program could mimic Control-Alt-Delete. Fast user switching has been around since like XP, I think, where it allows multiple users to log in at the same time, but only one user can be active in a Windows desktop. This is not true in a Windows server. In a Windows desktop, you can only have one user plugged using the system at a time. Automatic sign-in is not good for security. You should not let users, you should not let the computer log in automatically. That's not a good thing. It's fine if it's like a kiosk and we're not passing any important information through this kiosk, then fine. Or a public system. Assigned access is something new in Windows 10 that allows this system will allow only this user to log in. So John can only log in on John's computer. He can't log into any other machine. And yeah, the tool that can get passwords from the SAM database, it is in, I put it on our Discord, Mimikatz, MIMIKATZ. There is a naming convention that exists, and you can either copy or create your own. Either way, you should have a standard process for creating users on a network. It just makes life so much easier. There are some restrictions, though. For example, usernames have to be unique. You can't have two of the same. They have to be 20 characters or less. The users cannot be case sensitive, and they can't contain any other characters that you see here. Automatic login is not it's not the same as fingerprint system. Automatic login is no password. But you can't use any, these are the restrictions you have on creating a Windows user. Your administrator is the most powerful local user account. It is also the most powerful network account. Please, please, you do everything possible to protect the administrator. Everybody knows it exists. Everybody knows its ID ends with 500. Everybody knows it exists on every single system. Do everything you can to protect the administrator account. You can't disable it, or you can disable it. You can rename it. It is disabled by default in Windows 10, but you should change the password. You should rename it. You should disable it because everybody knows it exists. The guest is one of the least privileged user accounts. They have very little wiggle room in what they can do. Ideally, you should make systems based, or you should make user accounts based on the least privilege principle, which means users have access to only what they need and nothing more. And if the guest template is what matches what they need to do their work, then so be it. The initial account that's created when you install Windows is one that has administrative privileges. It's the one that you can use to do basic setup, and is one that you can remove after you have your system configured. The default account is basically the template. You can't necessarily interact with it like you can with other users, but it is the template. There are a number of default groups. Again, these are groups that everybody knows that exists, that if you want to be lazy, you would just automatically use. But if you want to be a little more secure, you might want to rename or change. So some of them are like the administrator groups, the backup operators, the cryptographic operators, this whole line. Generally, the four that you'll use are administrator, power users, and guests. Those are the four. Admin, power user, guest. with the power being given in that order from top to bottom. You can create users in either the settings, the control panel, or the MMC. Again, it derives, any new user derives its privileges from the local users group. A user can be promoted to administrator. But again, you don't want to do that. You really want to minimize the number of administrator accounts on a machine to prevent, or really to minimize the damage when it gets attacked. From the account settings, you can manage your own account or other accounts if you are administrator. The user account applet has been around since Windows 7. It's not as functional as it was back then, but you can still do a number of tasks through it. Here's what it looks like, where you can make changes to your account or another account. The MMC snap-in is the, I guess in a way, the old school way of doing things, but nonetheless, it's the one that's been around the longest and the one that you would interact with when you're dealing with things like Active Directory. The members of tab, that second tab in this picture, will show you any groups that a specific user is a part of. The profile tab will tell you where their profile exists. By default, it's locally. If we're talking about a domain, it can be on a server. So there's your member of tab. There is a box that says what will happen when the user logs in, and you can define a script for it to take action when a user logs in. You can define a home folder. You can define a number of things for each user, and you can actually do a lot more per user in Active Directory, which we'll get to in the second half of this course. Like I said, within a user profile, we have typically stored in C drive users, and it has things like app data, application data, the cookies, any contacts, along with all these other folders. Some of these folders you can see, some of these are hidden, and you'll have to show hidden files and folders in order to see some of these. There's quite the number of folders that exist per user, which is true for pretty much any OS. The default profile, like I said, is basically like a template that you use. It is what sysprep uses to generalize a new user. A mandatory profile is one that cannot be modified. They can change, so it allows users to do things like change their desktop background, but that change won't be saved. Funny enough, the only way to do this is by changing a single file's extension from dat to man. And I see a question, NetHood, yes. Network neighborhood, that is from the old days, from like Beyond XP. I think that's like 98 and ME. That's some old stuff. Windows is very much backwards compatible, which is one of its problems. A roaming profile is one stored on the network. This allows a user to log in to various Windows systems and still see the same desktop, still access the same files, and not have to copy them over as the user moves from one computer to another. It can slow the user down when they log in and log out, but that really depends on your network settings and network bandwidth. One way to fix that is by folder redirection. This avoids the slow sign in and sign out process that I was just mentioning earlier. That way, folders are just redirected rather than copied. The copy process is what slows down user interaction. The public profile is not necessarily a complete profile, but it has things that anybody can access from the system. So it's kind of like a cheap way to share files between users and a network. I mean, any interaction with Windows has to require the start menu. So I won't necessarily go deep into that. There are some advanced ways to authenticate yourself, and that can either be with a picture password, a PIN, Windows Hello, Passport, or smart cards. This is one that a lot of people don't know of, the picture password. I'll put this link right here. Now I'm going to mute this guy. You can watch this video later in its entirety, but just to show you, in order to authenticate, you have to do a specific action on a picture. So here the picture was chosen, and he's doing a specific action that he expects to do on the picture. Or here's the one with the cat, where, okay, set up some gestures and see if I can forward to the spot where he starts doing the gestures. So he did one gesture, he did a second one with one eye, there's the third. So he's going to confirm them. Right, one eye to one eye to the nose, nose to the eye. Cool. All configured. So then when he logs in, is him signing out. And okay, I want to log in. So, okay, if you want to log in, do your gesture. So one eye to the other eye. Okay, eye to the nose, nose to the eye. Awesome. Let him in. That is something you can configure. It is another way to secure your account. It's been around in Windows 10. But yeah, it's one of those little known things that you can do. You can also do a PIN. But remember that a PIN is only as strong as the numbers that are there. So if you use a 4-digit PIN, it will be very fast to crack. Biometric has also been around for a while. And that is fingerprint, facial, or iris scanning. Biometrics is not foolproof. For example, if you do fingerprint and you cut your finger, it won't be able to scan it the same way because your finger now looks different. Facial recognition, if you're sick, it may not recognize you, or if you're wearing a mask. Same with iris. If your eye isn't necessarily in the same way that it was when scanned, it might not go through. Windows Hello, according to this, Windows Hello doesn't store the actual picture of your biometrics. It stores a unique pattern that it will look at. Passport has been around for Windows 10 and is being used, especially in like the cloud with like Azure, to secure accounts. Smart cards, it has been around for quite some time, is used by a lot of companies. they'll use their ID card and they'll connect it to their computer, and that'll be how they authenticate. But the machine has to have a smart card reader in order to work. You can do virtual smart cards as well, just like you can do an eSIM for a phone. Like I was mentioning earlier, you can have users log on either locally or via the domain. And the domain portion is what we'll really dive into when we start talking about server. You can do a peer-to-peer network, like a work group. Everybody has to have the account. Everybody has their own SAM database. This is limited up to 20 connections. This is not good when you have a number of users and a number of computers. It's better to centralize with a domain, because each system has to have the same credentials everywhere, and that can be a pain to distribute. But it is possible. It's just, it stops becoming feasible after a while. A domain base, on the other hand, will have all the users centralized to one location. Everybody authenticates to one place, and that does make life easier to maintain and control access. So in a domain system, we have one controller who handles all that, and everybody else connects to it. All the machines have to be part of the domain, and then they'll be able to share the info. It doesn't have to be the same hardware. It can be different hardware connected all into one domain. And a little word of warning is Windows 10 actually caches credentials, which can be a problem if somebody's running something like the tool I mentioned earlier, who can go into memory and read the information and run with it. So just FYI, Windows does cache the credentials locally when a user is logged in. If that user gets breached, it is possible to go into memory, steal the hashes, and then crack those offline. And now to produce the next video. So we can take a little break. A little under halfway done. Oops. There we go. Windows needs to cache credentials because when you log on to a domain, you don't have to relog on to every service you access. So like a printer or a shared folder or a shared drive. You don't log in all over and over and over again. And yes, my other classes will be running at their usual time. Week 2, chapter 5. And we added to our playlist of 194. And no, it's not made for kids. Next, public. There we go. No, not all other OSs do that. And yes, my other classes will run at their usual times. And now let's record the last one. Okay. Chapter number 6, the security features. Windows has had for the longest time the local security policy, which is accessible generally through the administrative tools as a MMC. It has a lot of fine-grained options on what user or what group can do what on a system. You can restrict, you can allow. There's quite a number of things that you can do through the local security policy. It is part of the group policy. So naming implies you can set all these things from the domain controller and have those settings apply out to everybody, so you don't have to touch every system individually. This is what it looks like. The two big ones that are normally touched is the account policies and the local policies, the first two main folders. And then the other ones are touched depending on their need. So account policy handles anything that's account related. It doesn't affect domain accounts, especially when we're talking about a local system. But the settings that we have are things like the password history or the password age, the password length. If a password must be complex, which means uppercase, lowercase, letters, symbols. Stored using reversible encryption, that should always be a no. You don't want to secure passwords with a way to reverse it. You can define here when an account gets locked out and for how long. That is all well defined in this location. For how long will they be out? How many times can they try before they get locked out? And how long do they have to wait before they can try again? Your local policies can also help in things like auditing when a user logs in, what rights they have to do what on a system, which is important if you need to keep a trail on who accessed what when. Here's the user rights assignment. So for example, the administrator is the only one who can create a page file. There are a couple of users, like local service and admin, who can change the time zone. There's a couple of users who can change the system time. Some little things that you may not think about, but you can restrict who can do what on a system. So yeah, who can log on locally, who can back up files, who can load and unload device drivers, so on and so forth. You have quite the list of actions that a user can or cannot take. App blocker is kind of the same thing, but for applications, which applications are allowed and not allowed on a system. The last bullet point on this slide is important. You want to first audit. You want to first see what programs are being used before you start bringing down the hammer and saying what can and cannot run. This is the app blocker properties. You can enforce the rules as needed. But like I said, start with auditing before you start enforcing. And you can prevent or allow things like executables, installers, scripts, any packaged applications, or dynamic link libraries. App blocker is sitting towards the bottom of the security policies under application control policies. You'll see app blocker there. And that's where you can add the rules. Rule permissions say what can run or not run. And you can define that either by a file hash specifically. So this specific file can run as long as it has this hash, or any files in this folder, or any files that were made by a certain publisher. We can be pretty granular in what we allow and not allow. There's the path. We can make exceptions as well, just in case maybe we're testing something or we're testing an update. The software restriction policy is the older version of app blocker, if you will. Ideally, your system should all be within the same range, so you don't want to run the two together. You'd rather just run app blocker. You can configure the firewall here, and in the group policy version, you would apply a firewall rule that would take effect on all systems. Here's other things like the password policy. That's where it's at. That's what it looks like. You can do tasks like analyze and configure and export your security configuration and analysis. Auditing is definitely important, especially when you're working on a new system or you're setting up something. You want to know what's happening before you start applying rules. Definitely use your audit logs to see what's happening before you start creating rules to apply. And then later, once you apply a rule, you can go back and re-audit to see if what you want it to happen is happening. Another fancy way of just saying monitoring. So for example, in the event viewer, under computer management, you can see the audit log under security and see when something succeeded, when something failed, who did it, when, where, how. User account control, which came into existence in Windows 8, and we all hated it because it kept asking every single moment for every single action, do you want to do this? And then it got reduced later. It is what you see. It's that annoying thing that really took effect in Windows 8 and has been around since. You can disable it, but it's gotten better in Windows 10, so you don't necessarily want to disable it. It's a good thing that it comes up. An application manifest basically describes the structure of an application along with all the DLL files, the dynamic link library files that are required to run. This may mean that if a program needs certain rights and it's a legitimate program, we can grant it those rights without having to ask us every single time to run. You have these main 4 options when configuring the UAC to always notify you when an app try to make a change, try to make a change without dimming the desktop, or never. here's more detailed configuration options that you have available to you. When it comes to malware protection, it kind of seems like Microsoft should be the one on it, but they created that gap that tons of other companies have come in since, and they came back with Windows Defender, which kind of works and does the job. A quick security note. We are at the point where malware is the only term we really use, because a lot of malware has a number of features or characteristics from other tools. So for example, a malicious program that is that acts as spyware could also be a Trojan horse, could also be a backdoor. They're no longer their own separate category. So when you see terms like this, don't think that there is just a family of spyware. A lot of malware take characteristics from many and put them together. With that knowledge, a spyware is anything that only silently watches what you're doing and relays that information out. A virus can spread to other systems, but normally has to be started by the user. Windows Defender does have some real-time scanning and on-demand scanning to kind of see some of these actions and stop them as it recognizes them, just like any other antivirus. And just like any other antivirus, it has to update in order to know what new things are coming. You can configure when to do scans or how to do scans or what folders to exclude when it scans, just like you would in any other antivirus that exists. One of the differences, you can configure Windows Defender in group policy, so you can change the settings to multiple users across your infrastructure from the domain controller, not having to touch every single system. As we mentioned earlier, NTFS does have some permissions that you could use, like EFS. And then a quick little note on encryption, that you have the three main types: symmetric, asymmetric, and hashing when it comes to encrypting. Symmetric basically means the two sides have the same key, kind of like your front door. And if you have roommates or family, everybody has a copy of the exact same key. That is a symmetric encryption. Asymmetric means two people have different keys in order to lock and unlock, kind of like a mailbox, where anybody can drop something in, but only the person with a key can open it to see the contents. Hashing is what's used to store passwords. It's a one-way encryption, which means you can't reverse it. You can only encrypt. Once something is hashed, then, like a password, then the only way to figure out what it is by creating a dictionary, which those exist. Like I said, encrypting file system has been around since 2000, Windows 2000. And it works by using the user account, the user account identification number, in order to secure the files, to create a key to secure the file. So that's why you don't want to delete a user. You want to disable users. Windows 10 can generate a digital certificate in order to do it. You can also use a command line utility called Cipher to do the same. And it will encrypt the file or the files or the folder whatever the case may be. But just remember that you really want to disable accounts uh, when a user leaves so that you can access the data afterwards, which is exactly what I was talking about here. If that user is lost for whatever reason, we're going to have a problem. You can create recovery certificates just in case it's lost. And you can deploy a recovery certificate in a domain-based environment through the group policy rather than each individual user, which will be necessary in this kind of setup. It is possible to share encrypted files across the network as long as they have the certificates. Easier to do if it's a domain. Then you don't have to be the one controlling who has access to what key. As long as you're doing it through a domain base, it'll make life easier. If you are able to access the file, if you're the user who encrypted the file and you copy it into a partition that isn't NTFS, all the encryption will go away because, for example, something like FAT doesn't know what to do with it. So Windows will automatically unencrypt it into a FAT partition and show the unencrypted data. If you are trying to copy files that you don't have access to, it'll give you a access denied error. BitLocker has been around for a number of years as a way to encrypt the entire volume instead of just one file or a folder. It can work with a trusted platform module, which is a chip on the motherboard to cryptographically encrypt and encrypt data securely. You can turn it on and it will encrypt the entire drive, not just a little bit. Just like Linux or Mac, where in order to log in or in order to start up the system, you'll have to type in a password to open up the hard drive in order to boot from it. BitLocker can do the exact same thing. So it'll have an unencrypted system partition, and that's the one that only needs what it needs in order to start the operation, and then the encrypted partition that has everything else. You can have master keys and full volume encryption keys. This is good to change, to have different ways to unencrypt if one doesn't work. So basically a diagram of the last few slides. You have the volume master key encrypted by another key. So if somebody malicious is trying to get a copy of our drive, they can't just figure out what our password is. They're going to have to do some more digging in order to figure it out. So that means their data is safer. And if, let's say it's a laptop and it gets stolen, it's better that they wipe it, because that means our data will stay safe because they were able to get the keys in order to decrypt the data. You can use the network to unlock a BitLocker system. Of course, it is possible if it's UEFI and you have things like Windows deployment enabled. Then you can retrieve data that has been encrypted by BitLocker and is unable to get accessed. You can also disable it if you're no longer using it or it's no longer necessary. And you can apply it to like a USB drive. So you can take that USB drive encrypted with BitLocker and go around to another Windows system to unlock it. As long as that system has BitLocker as well, you'll be able to decrypt, read the data, lock it up again, and go on from one system to another. Windows Update can no longer be stopped. I think the maximum time that it'll let you wait is a few days, and then it will install updates, which are important to install. You ideally want to install things that are critical or important right away. It used to be through like service patches. Now they use branches instead to upgrade from one build to another. You have the 4 main branches: the Windows Insider, who gets to see everything first, the current branch for business, and the long term. Most users are on the current branch, whereas some companies can be on the current branch for business or the long term. Like I said, you can change when updates can be installed, but now they're just set to install at some point. The updates will get in place. And here's a view of the advanced options in Windows Update. For business, you can set up your own Windows Update server. So as long as the systems either can connect to your WSUS or are in the same network, they'll be updated through that instead of going to Microsoft.com to get those updates. Great if you want to control what updates make it into your network so they don't break things. Anything that's installed through the Windows Store can't necessarily be handled by Windows Update. You'll have to use the store to do that. And you can do that automatically as well. Cool. Like I said, for this week, we have a set of questions to answer, another assignment, which is from NetLab, and another quiz. Are there any questions? Okie dokie. Well, if you do come up with any, feel free to ask away on Discord. If you don't have your GCP credit, let me know and I will send that to you via Discord. If there's nothing else, then we can stop the live stream and we are good for the day.